This is a continuation of the Pentagon 9/11 chapter reading by Alfred Goldberg. And this chapter I'm going to read today is Identifying the Dead. It's a very important chapter, actually, because it shows how the Dover mortuary and other EMT officials went through the process of identifying those that were killed at the Pentagon crash site. As they removed bodies from the building, rescuers were at first uncertain about whether to establish a temporary morgue. In the afternoon of the attack, many body bags were laid out in the center court in anticipation of it becoming the field morgue. It had the advantage of relative privacy since entry to the building was closely controlled. But by the time soldiers of the old guard began bringing out bodies on the 12th, the FBI had set up a protected and controlled temporary morgue in North Parking. Refrigeration units stood by at the remote delivery facility loading dock. The Army had dispatched its sole active mortuary affairs unit, the 54th Quartermaster Company, from Fort Lee, Virginia, and activated a reserve unit, the 311th, based in Puerto Rico, that arrived on September 15th. Location and nature of the emergency, overlapping layers of jurisdiction. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit more, so this way you could see it. A little bit less, better. Can't fit everything. The statutory regulations that govern military operations added a legal dimension to identifying and laying to rest the remains of the dead, both military and civilian. Normally, the Commonwealth of Virginia exercised authority over crimes committed within its borders. But the unusual circumstance of an attack on U.S. soil by foreign terrorists and the resultant national emergency caused the Department of Justice and Defense to assume jurisdiction. Now, the reason why the Department of Justice took control of this and not the National Transportation Safety Board, which is basically the investigative unit for all airline accidents and crashes. But because this was due to a crime called air piracy, hijacking, it's a federal crime, and that involved the Department of Defense, and that's why Department of Justice, and that's why they were investigating the attacks. And because it hit the Pentagon, Department of Defense has their own investigation unit as well. Navy Captain Glenn Wagner, director of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, described that decision, quote, "So jurisdiction became a very important aspect since it clearly was an act of terrorism, and the FBI was running the operation. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney General really wanted to keep this on the federal side and were relieved to get confirmation that the Pentagon was an exclusively federal jurisdiction, that there wouldn't have to be any more state involvement than was absolutely necessary in the search and recovery. At that particular point, the AFIP and the mobilization of our resources and the mobilization of the Department of Defense resources became a priority," end quote. The FBI, in consultation with the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, directed AFIP to carry out forensic identification at the Dover Port Mortuary at Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. Now, just to add also, too, you had relatives that were aware that their loved ones were on flight, so some went to Dover Mortuary to give like T-shirts, toothbrushes, forks, anything that had like the DNA of themselves, because their DNA is linked to the loved ones that were on the plane. That's how they identified most of the people. Virginia's chief medical examiner requested and received a letter from the U.S. Attorney General relieving the state of forensic and mortuary responsibilities. Death certificates will be issued at Dover on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Until forensic activity shifted away from the Pentagon to Dover, AFIP senior staff coordinated on site with the FBI, Arlington County Fire Department, and state law enforcement officials, as well as their own chain of command, headed by the commander of the Military District of Washington. All parties worked together to recover remains while preserving crime scene evidence. Now, again, the federal and state law enforcement officials that were involved with the identification, recovery of human remains. For those no planers out there, that means now you have to involve the public sector. How do you do that for 23 years? How do you monitor every single body that was there for 23 years to make sure they don't slip up from the story you claim that they are told? And it's just, I don't know. And to be photographed and labeled in a controlled area twice daily, beginning on the 13th, in a continuous study of the FBI, the remains were transported under Virginia State Police and Fairfax County motorcycle officer escort from the Pentagon to Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir, some 15 miles south of the Pentagon. From there, Army CH-47 Chinook helicopters transported them 100 miles northeast to the Dover Port Mortuary. To ensure proper legal custody and continuous evidentiary control, FBI agents accompanied the remains until they were released to the medical examiner in Dover. As the bodies arrived at the base, a brief plain side prayer service was held, and a Dover AFB honor guard removed the remains from the planes. Since 1955, the Dover Port Mortuary had been the primary receiving point for America's military personnel and civilian employees and their families who died on overseas assignments. Although a new state-of-the-art facility lay in the future, in September 2001, the mortuary building was a typical military prefab structure. Nondescript, metal-sided, with a concrete floor fenced from the rest of the base. Its interior, resembling a warehouse with high ceilings and minimal furnishings, contained administrative offices, storage room, spaces for receiving and holding remains, medical examination and autopsy rooms, a mortuary clothing and supplies area, and a casket room. It had everything there. The permanent Air Force staff consisted of one mortuary affairs officer, two mortuary specialists, one non-commissioned officer in charge, and three administrative personnel supported by the 512th Memorial Affairs Squadron and the 436th Services Squadron. AFIP, the tri-service organization supervising the greatly augmented operation at the mortuary, had its origin, explained Captain Wagner, in the Army Medical Museum, established in the Civil War by the Army Surgeon General's directive to study combat injuries and infectious diseases. Its first forensic case was the autopsy on medical postmortem of Abraham Lincoln, following that of John Wilkes Booth. The Institute expanded in size and mission over the years. By 2001, it occupied 9 buildings on the grounds of the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington. For its Dover assignment, AFIP assembled more than 50 specialists and more than 400 personnel from across the country to conduct, according to Wagner, one of the most comprehensive forensic investigations in U.S. history. The experts, scientists, and technicians included military personnel under the direction of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner, a component of AFIP, regional and reserve medical examiners, forensic anthropologists from the Smithsonian Institute, the FBI, and the Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, autopsy assistants from AFIP and the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, experts from the AFME's Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, dental investigators headed by the director of the AFA's Department of Oral and Maxillofacial Pathology, and other staff support, including photographers. Wagner, the site commander, reported his day-to-day activities to the Air Force and its Air Mobility Command, and on a case-by-case basis to the Army Surgeon General's office and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military Personnel Policy. In addition, casualty representatives served as liaison between the military service and the Dover activity. As you can see, everybody's working in concert with one another. And this is why the Pentagon Shanksville investigation was clearly more advanced than that of New York, only because they practiced the coordination of different state, federal, and local law enforcements by having an annual exercise or annual meetings. If you go to my interview of Arlington County Pentagon Commander, on-scene Commander James Schwartz, he describes this in detail about how he and FBI agent that was in charge of the Pentagon, Chris Combs, basically worked together. Firemen and the FBI worked together in preparation for a national emergency attack on the nation's capital. And this is the reason why I think the Pentagon on-scene incident and the Shanksville incident were coordinated very quickly and very thoroughly. To perform its singular role in military medicine, AFIPs possessed the expertise required for complex forensic investigations. But the old mortuary building had not been designed for a task of the magnitude now underway. The hugely expanded staff of investigators and sophisticated equipment created crowded conditions. The dental area alone had to accommodate banks of computers, X-ray machines, digital sensors, and other specialized equipment. Oral pathologist Navy Captain Douglas Ardent, AFIP's chief of forensic and odontology, recalled that they used space carved from the shell of an old whole-body radiography area that was full of trash when we got there. We found a corner, and so we just moved out the trash. Inadequate air conditioning and lighting, as well as pest control problems, contributed to the unpleasant conditions, I bet. Administrative complications owing to the large number of agencies involved caused further slowdowns. The AFIP After Action report noted, for example, that it was unclear at first who would acquire the records of the Flight 77 casualties. Probably the pathologists, I would think. While the FBI ultimately assumed the responsibility, it took weeks to gather the records. The immense burden of family and national grief weighed heavily on all those engaged at Dover, motivating them to issue frequent and as accurate information as possible. Their work attracted intense public media and official attention. Emotional newscasts ran day and night. AFIP's public affairs office was swamped by inquiries. Congressional offices pressed for updates. Senior Army and Navy leaders called about subordinates or old friends among the soldiers and sailors killed in the attack. Some flag and general officers visited repeatedly. Captain Wagner observed that the intensity of this investigation, the personalness of this investigation, resulted in significant flag interest at every level in all services because everybody wanted to have the information before the next day. Remains of the 183 victims and the 5 hijackers sent to Dover bore the identification tags attached during the recovery effort, not just to, also to lay some more information about the 5 hijackers. They were never identified. And the reason why was simple, because the hijackers' families didn't give any samples of their DNA to the FBI. Why not? Was it because the FBI asked them and they didn't, or did the FBI ask them and never recorded it? Now, I would think it's the former. I read somewhere that some families were asked and some were not. What to believe, right? On arrival, they were scanned for the. Now, that's the reason why I say alleged hijackers, because what's not alleged is the hijackings themselves. But do I think it's these people? Yeah, the muscle hijackers for sure, because they're expendable. The power hijackers, some of them I have questions. Now, for those who know about me, and I have a question whether Ziad Jarrah boarded Flight 93. I can't say for sure. Was Hani Hanjour the pilot for Flight 77? Or was it another individual by the name of Mosed Kanair? Thank you, DJ Thermodetonator. On arrival, they were scanned for the presence of an exploded ordnance or other metallic elements and photographed. Where possible, FBI agents took fingerprints that could be matched against a database containing the prints of DoD uniformed personnel and civilian employees. While body radiographs documented injuries, the age of victims, and the presence of teeth and jewelry. Wallets, purses, credit cards, badges, military dog tags, or other identifying materials accompanied some bodies. These and other personal effects kept with the remains throughout the identification process were removed, photographed, and accounted for. 2 individuals were always present to witness the handling of such items. Once it was determined that those items had no further use as evidence, they were forwarded to casualty assistance officers who returned them to the next of kin. When characteristics of a body could be described, examiners recorded victims' height, weight, and skin and hair coloring, compiled and compared with reference information, including blood type. This data helped to identify many people. Autopsies also aided identification, disclosing scars, birthmarks, or other identifying features, as well as the presence of specific prescription drugs in the body. Such information could be checked against medical records of likely casualties, although this approach was inexact. Where possible, autopsies were performed to help determine the cause of death needed for the issuance of death certificates. Moreover, next of kin often wants to know how a person had died. The mortuary staff compiled reports of the cause of death when that information became conclusive. Eventually, autopsy reports were made available to the families. The tremendous energy generated by the impact of the airliner as it slammed into the building fragmented many bodies, making it impossible to identify them by visual means or by doing an autopsy. This is where the 9/11 truth movement, no plane crowd, I just don't understand, because they think, this is like, Looney Tunes, where you can go right to a wall, leaving an in-depth depiction of your body, and out the other side comes a body. It's not going to happen here. The body is 95% water. It's liquid, going to dissolve on impact. Imagine yourself in a plane inside a steel and metal tube airliner with 38,000 pounds of fuel, slamming into a building at over 450 miles an hour. It's not going to be much left of you. That's why there wasn't much left of the planes. It's called common sense. Stop listening to Alex Jones and Christopher Bolin. Stop listening. Stop watching to lose change. Ridiculous. Now, because I asked you to do this, do I think, do you think that I'm an official narrative type of person? Well, if you follow my channel, you'll know I'm not. There's no such thing as an official narrative. There's an incomplete one. 8 anthropologists worked alongside the radiologists and pathologists. Investigators matched the DNA profiles of 50 military facilities with the samples kept on file at the Armed Forces Repository of Specimen Samples for the identification of remains. In other instances, They compared specimens with the DNA supplied by family members, as I stated before. DNA evidence regarded by the public in the course of the gold standard for identification was not, however, always available because in many instances it too had been destroyed. For example, the most precise form, nuclear DNA, which testing reveals under unique characteristics, degrades quickly and is vulnerable to fire. Second type, mitochondrial DNA, more resistant to high temperatures, can require a month or more of laboratory time to process. And since only the mother's mitochondrial DNA carries on to subsequent generations, its use of proof for identity often requires additional genealogical research, particularly when there existed no soft tissue evidence or other markings for recognition. Forensic dentistry proved a powerful tool. Air Force Colonel Charles Pemble headed the group of odontologists, other dentists, and technicians from the 436th Dental Flight at Dover and the 81st Dental Squadron from Kessler Air Force Base in Mississippi. Pemble pointed out that dental examinations also furnished definitive data since teeth, which are calcified structures, are the hardest substances in the human body and generally much less susceptible than soft tissue to destruction by blunt force trauma or fire. Moreover, the arrangement of teeth is unique to each person. The forensic team employed traditional methods as well as a computer software program known as WinID that permitted postmortem dental radiology to compare with antemortem dental records. Through the use of such advanced digital and other technologies, the oral pathologists completed their work in just 1 month. Odontologist Arnott estimated that 65 identifications resulted solely from the dental investigation, a high percentage. Findings confirmed that most victims had died swiftly. Thank goodness. Comparatively, few died from slower acting burns or asphyxiation attributed to the fire itself. The greatest number died from blunt force injuries. The remainder died from other causes from effects that could not be determined. Given the level of charred and fragmentation, Captain Wagner thought that the real challenge in identification and determining the cause of death had not been the DoD folks, but the contractors and the airplane passengers and crew for whom it was more difficult to reconstitute medical and dental records. Only 5 victims, 2 from the Army, 2 from the Navy, 1 aboard the aircraft, could not be identified from remains. Although analysis indicated the hijackers' remains, their individual identities could not be determined since there was no reference dental or DNA information. The FBI took custody of them. By mid-November, the identification process was complete. Medical evidence and other relevant materials were turned over to the military services, whose task throughout had been to prepare the remains for burial and communicate with the families of the dead. The Army and Navy assigned liaison personnel to assist with the arrangements. The Defense Intelligence Agency coped with its civilian dead, and the FBI with the people on board the airplane, including the hijackers. To the Army's Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel fell the sad duty of fielding a liaison team to deal with the various matters required for a final disposition. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Campbell, the Mortuary Affairs and Casualty Support Division, explained that the job was finding health and dental records, working family reference samples for DNA if necessary, wards and decorations for uniforms, posthumous promotions, the identification that the medical examiner would need to do the state of Virginia death certificate. Team also forwarded information about the identification of remains, about Army personal effects and shipping arrangements, and finally, dressed the Army dead for cremation or burial. Headed by Thomas Ellis, civilian chief of DSSPER's Mortuary Affairs Branch, the team included Sergeant First Class Thomas Jones of the Disposition Branch and his Staff Sergeant Robert Bryson of the Repatriation and Family Affairs Branch. Jones had left a month or so earlier for an assignment in Japan, but requested to return for this duty. Campbell considered him uniquely qualified in that he was one of the few NCOs that had ever worked an incident. He knew what was going on, and having him back was helpful. Reservist Major Robert Chellepuk, a licensed funeral director and involvement in the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office, was recalled for duty at Dover. He and Sergeant First Class Albert Brown, who had been present at the crash scene, relieved Ellis and Bryson at the mortuary. And, that's how they identified the remains over there at the Pentagon. And then also they used that same process over in Shanksville as well. Pennsylvania mortuary, headed by, oh, goodness gracious, I'm going to forget that gentleman's name. And excuse me, I forgot his name. It's been a while since I said his name. Wally, damn, forgot his last name. Wally something. And Thanks again to the No Plane. Thanks to Citizen Investigation. I wanted to interview this man, and I reached out to him, and his office said he will never do interviews ever again about 9/11 with anybody because he was harassed by the idiots at the Citizen Investigation team. An idiot by the name of Dom DiMaggio. These people just ruined, future discourse for 9/11, probably forever. Well, anyway, it's the end of this chapter. Thank you very much for tuning in and taking an interest. And I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.